Back to Voyager. Natural Law was the last episode that we hadn't covered yet, so we are pushing that back even further now. We kick things off with a shuttle flying over a jungle, and it's going to crash. Know how I know it's going to crash? Because it's not the Delta Flyer and it's over another planet. It's going down. Chakotay wants to admire their view on the way to a conference, but the shuttle starts shaking on account of an energy barrier below them, using technology by an assimilated species, so it must be good stuff. It messes with their shields and the warp core goes offline, but luckily, Seven is able to tech up a small hole in the barrier to beam themselves through before they crash. Yeah, called it, and fast too. Chakotay arrives with an injury to his leg, but Seven says there's some good news. With all the parts of the shuttle that came through, they should be able to assemble a beacon to call for help. So while they get on with that, we enter the B-plot. Tom Paris is caught violating traffic ordinances, and they tattle to Janeway about it. As a result, Tom Paris is required by the laws of this civilization to duel a champion of their choosing in an arena with his choice of... Nah, I'm just kidding, but admit it, I bet some of you at least thought I expect nothing less from this show. Tom will actually be taking piloting lessons, despite the fact that it'll be of zero help since they'll never be flying here again, but Janeway is all in favor of making them miserable and rubber stamps this. I think it's very important that everyone learn all the rules of safety. It's a great guide to where you can cut corners. Back in that jungle, Chakotay picks up signs of humanoid life, but not Ladosians. Those are the locals who have the strict traffic laws. They find a few gathered around a watering hole, engaged in primitive behavior. I mean, not using primitive as a pejorative in this case. I'm using it as a shortcut to say that they're operating on the level of a Stone Age culture, so I'm just saying primitive is shorthand. Although having to explain that probably actually took longer. Anyway, point is, they're Flintstoning it down there, despite the Ladosians being technologically advanced.
I'll contact you if I find anything useful.
I guess I don't have to tell you to avoid interacting with these people.
Yeah, I'm sure that Seven is champing at the bit to have a chat with a member of the Neolithic Society. She finds some tech to help with the plan, but the locals have found Chakotay.
7 of 9 to Chakotay.
That's how we handle things we don't understand. Despite not being fans of technology, they aren't otherwise harmful, and they take Chakotay away to try to help him. Well, now that the cat's out of the bag, Chakotay wants to stay here, despite Seven's objections to the plan. But still, though, it's got to be a lot nicer than trying to sleep outside. Then again, their reaction to the first piece of technology they saw isn't encouraging for somebody who is filled with technology. Back on Voyager, the driving instructor has arrived.
I am Mr. Clegg, the flying instructor. Are you Lieutenant Paris?
He is.
I didn't think that plotline could get any stupider, but thanks for suggesting how it could have been by pointing at Harry. All we need is for an hour-long run of Rick Berman's collection of Asian driver jokes. Instead, our one-note joke is that this guy is a super serious instructor, so instead of Tom just skipping straight to the test to prove that he's a very capable pilot, he's got to go through the long and rigorous process instead. That'll be fun. How don't I sing about this episode? In the jungle, the quiet jungle, Chakotay sleeps tonight. When he gets up, he starts trying to learn the locals' language. It's sign language, actually, but that's not surprising at all. In North America, there was a universally understood form of sign language that was used for trade among many tribes throughout what is now Canada and the central and western U.S. So, if this followed that trend, then the first inclination would be to teach Chakotay the lingua franca of the area rather than their own specific dialect. So yeah, I am versed in Native American culture, from watching Ernest Goes to Camp. Chakotay is using this to discuss how to make a map of the area. So when Seven says she thinks she knows where to find the component that's needed to make the little communicator, he says to ask one of these people to help guide her. She thinks That's an awful idea. It will further expose the locals to their advanced technology. So Chakotay finally lets her go off on her own. Well, naturally, she trips and drops the tricorder down the one crack in the entire jungle, so that when night falls, she is completely lost and helpless. A storm rolls in because God finds it hilarious that a woman who talks so much about efficiency and perfection goes around all day in boots with heels. Luckily for Seven, the girl who had been watching her earlier followed her and helps to take care of her out here, starting a fire to keep warm. Exposure is actually the most common cause of death in the wilderness, so good on her. And speaking of surviving a hostile situation, Tom's class. The guy goes through the Delta Flyer controls like the ultimate safety Nazi. Although it kind of shows how Nazis really come to mean anyone with an iron grip on every trivial detail. No one ever thinks of a literal safety Nazi, right?
Have you any idea how fast you're going? Oh, blitzkrieg this, blitzkrieg that. You get out and walk until you learn your lesson.
Exactly my point. Why should I be held responsible for the ship's design flaws?
According to the maintenance records, you were this vessel's chief designer.
Yes, well, that's how terrible the designer was. He switched the record and put my name down just to get me in trouble. So while Paris deals with the pain, Seven wakes up in the woods under a blanket covered in Skittles. After the girl feeds her, Seven draws out a map, hoping that she can lead them to the missing component, although they first stop at a beautiful pool with a waterfall. No skinny dipping there, but honestly, that's for the best. I've no idea how old that girl is, and I'm not in the mood to find out. Back at the camp, Chakotay is concerned that Seven isn't back yet, and adding to his problems is that one of the women has found a piece of Voyager tech and tied it above her eye to imitate Seven's look. Because that's as close as she can possibly get. No internet, after all, so she can't Google "steal her look" and just order the same piece. Seven finally gets to the nose of the shuttle to start rummaging around, unaware there's a bit of evidence pointing their way. When they don't check in, Harry and Tuvok go searching and find a piece of the shuttle resting on top of the barrier. Well hidden, only the Borg sensors that Seven installed allows them to actually see it. They call up the ambassador to ask about this barrier.
We'd have warned your commander, but his flight plan didn't go anywhere near that area.
Oh great, now Chakotay's going to have to take piloting lessons too. The guy explains that the barrier is not their doing, it was put in place by an alien race. The people hanging with Chakotay are obviously far, far less advanced technologically than their competitors, and rather than allow them to be killed off, oppressed, or, irony, assimilated, the aliens put an energy field in place that cannot be removed by the Ledosians. I should mention that one theory is that the aliens who did this were the Preservers, the aliens that were mentioned in TOS, and also that they might be the same race that were shown in The Chase as being the first form of life that seeded all of the others. If so, though, they met a rather ignoble end, because the reason that it's ironic about that assimilation is that this species has been assimilated. Seven recognized them and referred to them by a Borg designation. But it could mean that Voyager might have the answer.
If Seven were here, she might be able to figure out a way to get through it.
Yes, what a pity there's no other Borg on board this ship, right, Icheb? But Seven has figured out that there's a magnetic field causing the problem here. Natural magnets are all over the place and a complete waste because these people have no refrigerators to stick them to. Well, they could solve this if they dragged this part of the shuttle somewhere else, but that would be a bit of a haul, and Chakotay is injured and Seven couldn't walk through the woods without falling down and nearly turning an ankle, so they would need to get some help. Chakotay is not happy with that idea. Seeing them imitate Seven and Chakotay is worrying to him, but Seven points out that if they don't do this, there's likely no way that they will ever leave. The technology pieces will all be left lying around here, and the locals will be able to gather all the pieces up and start doing all kinds of things with them. Wouldn't that be worse? Once they've been rescued, Voyager can beam up all little schnibbles and then neutralize the barrier. Victory all around. Plus,
Phasers are starting to overload.
it will stop the Voyager crew from accidentally blowing themselves up. Fortunately, they try switching to a torpedo, and that will require rigging and tweaking and all of that. It's always rough jailbreaking a photon torpedo, and they're never the same afterwards, but usually only needed for about 5 minutes after that anyway. Seven manages to bring the barrier down completely, but her new friend was too curious for her own good, crept over despite the warnings, and got zapped. Seven stays to treat her while Chakotay is beamed up to be treated in sickbay, where he explains what's happened. But there is more news. Now that the barrier is down, the Ladosians are looking to move in, study these people, utilize the potential natural resources, and also provide medicine and education. Essentially, all the stuff the Prime Directive seeks to avoid. Except for the study them part, and even that's supposed to be without their presence being known, unless a moment arises when Paul Servino is feeling kind of horny. Then all bets are off. Chakotay is aghast, but Seven thinks that maybe this could be good for these people.
They're intelligent people. Exposure to education and technology may give them better opportunities.
Can you honestly say that you know what's better for them?
This leads to such an essential part of the episode that unfortunately is now glossed over. Last week we looked at the Prime Directive in Homeward, that it is a mostly noble idea that sometimes gets twisted to bad ends by a flawed moral view. Natural law takes the entire idea of the Prime Directive and turns it sideways. Another species, without the Prime Directive, committed what we would consider a violation of it by interfering in this world's natural development, to separate the two humanoid species on this planet from each other so the one could not interfere with the other. Whether we think that that's the right choice or the wrong choice, that's not relevant. Voyager has, out of necessity, removed the barrier, which essentially undoes the original violation. So, what is the correct course of action for Voyager here? Does non-interference mean that we should restore the barrier, since that was the way it was before Voyager arrived? Or does non-interference mean that this technology should remain down to restore it to the original state before it was interfered with? That's a question with real potential to it, and natural law would have benefited from being a two-parter to have a chance to really explore that. We know practically nothing about the more advanced species, but oodles about the Stone Age one. What's more, in a few episodes, Seven and Chakotay are going to be dating. This would have been a prime opportunity to help establish a foundation for that. Even the Tom plot could have benefited. Like I said, we learn almost nothing about the Ladosians. What if instead of this one-note gag of piloting lessons, he was doing community service instead? He has a variety of skills and knowledge after all. Maybe he could be helping a scientist who, it turns out, is trying to learn about the other civilization through distant telescopic flybys on satellites, because it could be a breakthrough in understanding important things about their own history, and possibly solve some of their current problems. So that opening it up would do him or her a great service in advancing their knowledge and possibly benefiting both groups. Or something else. Point is, ideas with a lot of meat on them come along, and so often it's disappointing that the way they are wrapped up in so perfunctory a manner. What's more, there's a very obvious issue here that they totally ignore. Or rather, they bring it up and ignore it anyway. The point is that at no time does it ever occur to anyone on Voyager, why don't we ask them? Chakotay actually gives that condescending, can you honestly say you know what's better for them, before then presuming that he knows what's better for them. The principle of the Prime Directive is that a civilization should chart its own path and make an informed choice rather than us choosing for them. You don't know what's best for this species. It's arrogant for you to presume you know what's best for this species. You should go down there and tell them what these new people want to do, what you would gain, what you would lose, and let them decide. Oh, and before anyone tries to correct me on this, about how, well, Janeway said they have to take their technology with them. They have a policy of not leaving it with others. Yeah, they will totally leave their technology with other people. It's just sometimes they refuse because, well, the other species are assholes. So yeah, since they're worried that the Ladosians are going to be assholes here, Janeway says they're leaving and they're taking their deflector with them. So they've got 1 hour to get their people out. Well, instead, the Ladosians attack Voyager to knock out their transporters. So the only one that is in any position to do anything now is Tom, right in the middle of his driving test. Still, he's an incredibly talented pilot, so despite the frustrations of his driving instructor, he beams up the survey team, but after his transporters are down, he just blows up the deflector, flies out, and calls it a day. There's a Chakotay 7 coda that doesn't really lead to anything. The end. Post-episode follow-up, Neelix joins in dogpiling Tom about being stuck doing a driver's test, when we should all admit he is damn lucky they didn't send a health inspector into his kitchen. He'd get the death penalty. We have a burn baby burn for Chakotay and Seven shuttle, but I'm sure you all saw that coming. Final score for Natural Law is 6 out of 10. It just doesn't quite make good use of what it's got. It's got so many of the pieces there, but it doesn't quite execute on it. It could have been so much more of the 7 Chakotay stuff to set that up. It does a good job of establishing these indigenous people, and hey, props for not making them another oh-so-wise and enlightened society like so often happens in these stories. They're just people with their own culture. But the Ladosians don't even rise to the level of Planet of Hats here, completely undefined, and Tom's subplot is just a one-note joke that goes nowhere. With more room to thoroughly explore the unique opportunity this story presented, this could have been a classic. Instead, it's just a typical Voyager episode.
All hail